Well, good morning if you are in Los Angeles, California. Good afternoon if you are in Indianola, Iowa, or Des Moines, Iowa, or New York City, where I am. Good evening if you are in Bayreuth or Accra in Ghana, or anywhere around the world where people listen to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all over the world. Today's program is actually being pre-recorded on July 14th of 2025 because my guest is a very busy man. He comes into port once every 7 years. And he's bass-baritone Ryan McKinny, currently performing the role of the Flying Dutchman at Des Moines Metro Opera in Greater Des Moines, Iowa, which I want to talk to you about in a moment. But Ryan McKinny, welcome.
Hey Fred, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to chat with you.
So, um, for people who don't know, you're not from Des Moines, but um, Des Moines is in the middle of the middle of the middle of the United States.
It is.
Iowa, in many ways, is the prototypical American state in all of our contradictions as a country and has been politically very progressive, politically very conservative, open to new things in the arts. It has, at the University of Iowa, perhaps the best or one of the best writing programs in America for authors. And everyone from Tennessee Williams to Ann Patchett to many, many more great writers studied at the program in Ames, Iowa. There's Iowa State University. When I was a kid, we took the Iowa exams because Iowa was considered a gold standard in terms of academic achievement.
Hmm.
And we had to pass the Iowa tests here in New York City and in much of the country. I don't think that's the case anymore because many textbooks in America are written to Texas standards, which is a whole
Hmm.
other thing.
Yeah, it
Um,
is.
but as our country changes, evolves, and so on, maybe Iowa is not held up as the model. But Iowa, I'll give you one example of Iowa too. One is when Iowans, because it's such a heavily agricultural state, Iowans study history, they study politics, they study geography, they study climate, they study all of that because they have to know where their products are needed and
Hmm.
how to get them there. So pork from Iowa or corn from Iowa or many products from Iowa um, go all over the world. So even though it's the middle of the middle of the middle of the United States, um, its products go to the borders, go to the coasts, go to what we call the Gulf of Mexico, and go out to all kinds of places from there. That's example number one. My personal memory of Iowa, um, I went there a couple of times. I went to college in an adjoining state, Wisconsin, but I actually went to Iowa on the other side. I was visiting Omaha for work and
Hmm.
traveled into Iowa and took a hayride. Ryan, have you ever taken a hayride?
I think when I was like a kid, I think I did, yes, but it's been a
It
minute since
was one of the most exquisite experiences I've ever had.
I've done
It was late October of 1992, and it was sort of misty, and the clop, clop, clop of the horses going through the countryside as those of us there together lay in the back on the hay and looked up at the sky, and it was moist. It was the most idyllic experience I think I've ever had, apart from going sled riding in Alaska with sled dogs. Just this wonderful connection to nature that is very much part of the experience in much of the United States, but especially right in the middle.
Yeah,
So, if I'm
beautiful.
correct, you're from Los Angeles, is that
That's
right?
fine. Yeah, I'm from
So
I'm
talk about being an LA boy currently working in Iowa, where you're singing one of the great roles in opera.
Yeah, I will say I definitely had an idea that Iowa was a little more like what sort of Nebraska or Kansas looks like, kind of flat, just, cornfields. But actually, like in Des Moines proper, really beautiful, kind of slightly rolling hills. especially where I am, there's these beautiful trails here next to this river. And it's really lovely. It's definitely, I mean, I think people here think of Des Moines as a big city, and to me, it's a having grown up in LA and spent a lot of time in New York. It feels like a smaller town, but with all of the cultural things you would want in a big city, which is really lovely. And I have to say, I mean, it's funny that people ask me what have I done while I've been in Des Moines. For the most part, I've been worrying about the Flying Dutchman because, as anyone who knows that role well will know that it is quite a challenge, and so a lot of my job is to just keep my voice happy, and so I tend to be a little bit of a hermit. But the audiences have been amazing, and the people of the company are all so sweet. Everybody I've met here has been awesome, and it's quite striking how supportive this community is of the opera. DMMO really has something special going here.
So Des Moines Metro Opera is a very well-regarded company, very well-regarded. And people think of the United States for the Met in Chicago and Houston and LA and San Francisco and Atlanta now and Washington and Seattle and all of our famous companies, and they're all great. There are a lot of innovative companies in places like Philadelphia and Baltimore and Denver throughout the country, and there are festivals. Des Moines Metro Opera is kind of like a festival in that it has a limited engagement of about a month or so, a little more. But with the difference is that, number one, and I want you to describe it, the actual playing space where they perform in Indianola, which is outside of Des Moines, is very particular, and the way the audience connects to the performers is distinct, but also because they're adventurous in their repertory. Mm-hmm. They don't only do Tosca, Bohème, and La Traviata.
Yeah.
So talk about the space itself where you perform.
I'll start with the second thing first, because there was for anybody that's curious, there was a really interesting article in the New York Times that Zachary Wolf wrote about DMMO just this last week that talks a lot about the general director, Michael Eagle's programming and how it's been a lot more progressive, which we can talk about too. But the space is really, I mean, if you're going to ask me, why should I see opera here? The most straightforward answer is the space itself, because not only is it a theater in the round situation, we have a circular playing space in the middle of an audience that, takes up, 270 degrees of what you're looking at. But also the pit is right in the middle of our playing space. So there's this just hole in the middle of this circle that we can walk around and play around. And it creates, and it's also a very small theater. So I don't know what the exact number of people is, but I imagine it's something like, 300, 400, 500, something like that. And the audience is really close to you. So, I'm singing Die Frist ist and right here is somebody with their program. And also because of the way the pit is oriented, you don't have any balance issues really ever, which is not the case usually with the Flying Dutchman specifically.
When you say balance, you mean tonal balance, volume?
Between the singers and the orchestra. Okay. So most of the time, if you see the Flying Dutchman at a big opera house, even with the biggest honking voice out there, Grieg Grimsley or whoever singing the Dutchman, you will often have issues with the orchestra playing louder than the singers because of the way Wagner wrote it. It's just kind of inherent in the piece. And so doing it in this space, it's just really not something that you have to worry about very much. So that means that you can do a lot more dynamic range as a performer. You can lean into certain moments that otherwise you might not be able to. And audiences love it. If you love opera, you most of the time, even if you have great seats at the Met, even if you're in the 5th or 10th row, you're still quite a long ways away from the singers. I love the Met, and it's an amazing place to see opera. But just for variety's sake, getting to see some great singers and hear them very close, 5 5, 10 feet away from you is quite an experience. And also that space kind of is encouraging of a certain sort of movement on stage that I think keeps pretty much everything that stage there in this, having this kind of kinetic energy. You really are not going to see what, we fondly call park and bark, sort of traditional, you plant yourself and sing an aria thing that you see sometimes at big opera houses. That's just not going to happen here, because you kind of need to share with the whole audience and they're all around you. So you can't spend too much time with one sort of section of the audience. And it makes for very like dynamic stagings.
So if an artist is close enough to an audience member, it's possible to make eye contact, but you, not just you, but your colleagues, go in and out of character. I mean, if you're singing to Senta or to Eric or any of the characters in The Flying Dutchman, you're singing to them unless you're looking away. There's a very boring production, I won't say who did it, of The Flying Dutchman, in which basically Senta is here, the Dutchmen are there, and their big duet goes on and on and on, and they never look at one another. It's a big theater. They're looking out into the audience.
Of that.
And, if I were directing that opera, I would have them sing to one another, or at a certain point, move closer or develop an intimacy as the text and the music indicate that they're beginning to recognize something in another. She says, I need this guy to set me free and from the boredom of everything of my life here. And he thinks this may be the one, so I don't have to go gone for 7 years again. In that production, there was none of that. Yeah. But if you're in a production like the one you're in now, how was it directed and how do the performers do it so that they're creating the drama of the story and the music, but also mindful that perhaps when you look away from her, there's an audience member there? And do you engage with the audience member, or you just sort of blur your eyes? Do you wear contact lenses or glasses? Or
I don't actually. I used to. I got LASIK surgery like 3-4 years ago. It's been
amazing. Because Maria Callas was very, very nearsighted, so she didn't see even her colleagues a lot of times. But
yeah, so acting is a big topic for me. It's something I really care about, and so this is a great opening for me to talk about that for a second, which. My job when I'm on stage is to see what I need to see for my character to tell the story to the audience. So if I'm looking, like right now, I'm looking at Fred on my screen. You might not be able to see when it changes, but now like I'm looking at Zenta, right? She's right where your eyes are, but I see her there. So when I look in the audience, even if they're that close, I'm not seeing them. I'm looking past them, right? I know that they're there, but I'm not looking at them. Although there might be a case like if I was doing Leporello and like I'm doing a lot of asides, I would sing it directly to a person. But so in the case of this, them being closer far away doesn't really change how I approach it in terms of when I'm turned away from somebody, I need to have some vision of something, right? I need to have an idea that I'm playing my action to, as we call it in our nomenclature. So that's kind of one thing. But then to get to your question about the Dutchman, I totally agree with you. I've been in productions where you are, for that whole duet, at least the whole first half of it, kind of just in your own world, staring out at the audience. But there's so little time between the two of them that's really difficult to convince an audience that they have any feelings about each other when like they never even really look at each other. It's already awkward with the way Dalan sort of sells her to the Dutchman, But in this production, we talked about that really early on with Josh Borst, the director, who I really like a lot. I really like his production. That even though our text in the beginning of the duet isn't directly speaking to one another, that it works much better to have this kind of eye contact and like getting closer and then moving away, feeling like we wish we could touch each other, but we don't just yet. That kind of tension works way better than just being in our own worlds and singing out to the audience, which in the case of this space makes a lot more sense anyway, because we don't want to be just stuck in one position. So we have this kind of it's not constant, but often on sort of circling movement in this production, the duet specifically, that I think works really well. We sort of circle around the pit and then meet each other, and like almost connect and then break away. But yeah, I think contact between Zenta and the Dutchman as often as possible in the short amount of time we see them together is like really kind of integral to believing any of it.
I mean, I'm a big believer in opera and in some theater that when two characters of whatever their background is have an incredibly strong, intense feeling for one another, but don't touch, it's more sexy, more exciting, more dramatic than if they do.
Yeah.
This is not a role that you would do, but in Un ballo in Maschera, when the king or the governor and Amelia have their 9-minute mommy, you love me, M apostrophe AMI. When they finally touch, it's like, wow. And Verdi put it in the music right there that this is where they suddenly will touch. But Tristan and Isolde, for example, or Aida and Radames, there are many, many couples throughout opera of all backgrounds who don't touch, or when they finally do touch, it's a big deal. I was thinking the other day, there was a play that was done, you'd have been a little kid, many, many years ago called Bent. I don't know if you ever heard about it. It was written in the UK and then came to New York and starred Richard Gere and the late David Dukes. And it was a true story about two men who were, at the term of the time, was homosexual, who were Germans and were sent to a concentration camp and discovered one another in the camp and had an incredible attraction to one another and understood why they were there. And there's a very long scene that Richard Gere and David Dukes, especially Richard Gere, did, where they just spoke to one another. And they stood facing us in the audience, and they were wearing sort of gray, horrible clothing. But it was the most thrilling, erotic, beautiful, and very sad scene because they didn't and couldn't touch.
Yeah.
And I was thinking about the other day because I was talking to someone, frankly, about this Flying Dutchman production that we were just referring to, about how touch and proximity are so important in opera direction and in theater direction. You don't have to. I'm wondering, too, in this production and perhaps other productions in Iowa, how the performers interact or not with the conductor, and where the conductor is positioned vis-a-vis the performers.
Yeah, I just to follow up 1 second on the not touching thing. I think what's really important if you're going to have that kind of energy, which I think is wonderful, is that you build the tension between the two people, right? Sometimes you have them not touch, but they're just not connected at all, and it feels like there's nothing happening. And I think that's often when directors will throw in like, oh, well, you should just like be hugging or kissing or whatever, because they can feel that there's nothing happening. But that if you have two very good actors or a director that really knows how to talk to the singers, building that tension that you want to be touching and you're not yet is kind of like where it really works. The other scene I was thinking of is when I've done it a couple of times where it really worked was the La Cirarem duet in Don Giovanni, where like he's seducing her purely with his voice, right? That it doesn't need to be a touch. And if it finally does have a touch right at the end, maybe just a hand with Andiam, then that feels like electric. Whereas if they're all over each other.
I'm telling audience members, he's saying, let's hold hands. She says, vorrei e non vorrei. I'd like to, but I wouldn't like to.
Yeah.
She's very tentative about that.
Yeah.
Andiam, he says, Andiam, let's go. It's a very seductive duet, and you're absolutely right. There's another pair of characters who touch, but I'm going to get to them later because I want to stick to the Flying Dutchman, or characters who don't touch. The Flying Dutchman, you did in Chile.
Yeah, I did
A few months ago. I worked in that theater a number of years ago, the National Teatro Municipal in Santiago, Chile. It's a wonderful theater with, when I was there, and I'm sure now, a great administration. And what they're known for, among many things, is they construct scenery. I don't know if you know this, but the Teatro in Buenos Aires constructs costumes,
Mm.
and the Teatro Municipal in Chile constructs scenery. And they often create productions together that are, because Chile is near a port in the Pacific Ocean, these productions are sent all over the world, but especially the Pacific part of the United States, Mexico, Canada, Asia, as rentals. And the company makes a lot of its money by building these productions. Um, it's a more traditional proscenium theater. And how is your performance there different? And is anything of your Dutchman from Chile brought to your Dutchman in the round in Iowa?
Yeah, I would say that, I've worked with our director there was Marcelo Lombardero, who I've worked with quite a few times, and I really like him. Uh, it's a beautiful theater. I love that theater, and I really like the production. Marcelo does really interesting things with projections that are sort of hyper realistic, sort of minimal set pieces. Um, I actually to be honest, learned a lot through that run because I was really struggling with the pollution there, and the
Mm-hmm.
dryness, my voice, and also some allergies that were like new plants to me.
Yeah, I
So
know.
I actually like really had to work at pacing it, and some performances were better than others, but that it brought me to um, kind of reapproach the role technically to really because I had to fight to be able to really do it in a way that I was happy with because of, anybody that doesn't know, Santiago is in the middle of this mountain range and is known, to have really intense pollution, and also very, very dry air. A combination of which you can imagine is not amazing for singing opera, but it kind of made me reapproach the role from a vocal standpoint. It was really helpful, and that sort of has continued and has felt this summer to be like, oh, I know how this role works in my voice now, and I can really lean into it. So that's been really great. Um, it's a very different, that production and this one are kind of as different as you can imagine them. I think, Marcelo's he likes a lot of stillness and a lot of long thoughts, which I think works really well in that kind of setting, and uses actually, like we were talking about, the tension, uses kind of tension between characters and stillness as a way to build up the anticipation in the scene, and less movement, I think, just naturally because it's a proscenium rather than circular. So, but it has been interesting to be back with this role. I did it at Glimmerglass quite a long time ago. I did it in Hawaii. I did it in Hamburg. Did Minnesota Orchestra once. So I've done a few of these, but it's been several years since I've come back to it. And so now being back with it this year, it's exciting because my voice is very different. I'm a different person. And so it's grown a lot.
I'm not asking about this or any other production, but your conception of him, of the Dutchman. What happens to him at the end of the opera?
Um, this is a little bit of a philosophical thing with me. Just, I'm a person who, as an actor, I feel like there's no one answer. There is a version of the Dutchman that he's redeemed. He goes into nothingness, essentially. He's done. There's a version where him and Zenta live happily ever after. I think you could play a version of it that he isn't redeemed. My feeling is with these pieces, what I like about it is there's so many ways to look at it, and I sort of have an annoying, I really don't like when I'm in a rehearsal room and a singer says such and such character would never do that.
Right.
And I say, well, if you do it and you're playing that character, then yes, they would. I think there's ways to justify lots of different, ways of handling, both as a director or as a singer. And one thing I say when I teach acting a lot to younger singers, my phrase is, there's no right or wrong choices, only more or less interesting ones. So all of that is preamble. I think that, essentially death is the way I think of it, right? That he gets to finally be dead, which is what he's been asking for. And what you think, there's the image of the two of them together at the end, which I sort of think of as like heaven or, afterlife at any rate. I think is the most kind of straightforward take of it. But I think there's so many interpretations possible. I think it's an opera that has a icky enough libretto. It's a thorny libretto that it
I can hear Richard Wagner saying, "Aber was ist icky?"
One thing I love about Wagner is that I basically toss out anything he ever wrote about himself for his own music. And actually, I've said this to a lot of my friends who are living composers, which is that I think most composers who are really wonderful, like just talented composers, have this way of like channeling humanity that they themselves don't really understand. And the sooner they can get away from it and let somebody else interpret it, the better. Usually what they say about their pieces is wrong. So anyway, all that to say, I think, there's a lot to work with for a director that wants to take a different approach. I think there's a lot of, suicide is such a intense topic, and like, the idea that she does this and it's a positive thing, I think is very hard for modern audiences to swallow. And so that lends itself to lots of different interpretations. And I've been in versions of it where it's more or less a positive or negative thing. And, she's been abused in some way, which I think holds up in terms of the libretto. I mean, Dallant is so ready to sell her to this man that's like, knows nothing about the second he sees all the treasure. Where is mom? We don't really know. Like, there's a lot of stuff in there to be interpreted. So, yeah, maybe that's my way of squirming out of the question a little bit. But
well, no, part of why I'm asking is because many directors who study this opera, work on this opera, decide that it should be taken from Zenta's point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And I often point out, as the opera is called The Flying Dutchman.
Yeah.
And Leontine Price, who I was honored to work with a lot, when people would say to her, well, don't you think that Amneris is the better role? And she said, no, darling, he named it Aida.
Yeah, and I mean, in The Flying Dutchman, we don't hear from Zenta until Act 2. So like,
no.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that happens is that it's in most productions hard to believe that he cares about her outside of she can do something for him. But actually, I like this production because it handles that really in an interesting way, which is that I'm playing this idea that when the angel promised me the potential freedom from this curse, that he also kind of gave me an image of who this person would be. Mm-hmm. That when I see her picture, when I'm with Dallant, finally, there's this, it's interesting, it's a very transactional scene for a while. And my interpretation of that is the Dutchman thinks, well, I might as well curse another one of these women. Like I'll ask, and probably she'll say that she's going to love me forever, but she's going to turn out to not care about me at all. And so there's this kind of like, yeah, sure, buddy, like take all my treasure that I don't care about because I have so much of it. You're cursing your own daughter. It's your problem. Until, this moment that I think is the first kind of sincere musical moment in that duet, when I sing "So ist sie mein, wird sie mein Engel sein." So she could be maybe she'll be my angel. And in this production, that's the first time he shows me her picture, is right before that line. So to me, it's like I recognize this person, like I've loved this person for eternity, and this is the one. That gives it a different stakes from just like she's like everyone else until she kills herself at the end, which I think is the sort of more basic interpretation. And so in that way, this does follow my story at least as much as hers, because it gives me more of something to hang on to. The hope feels more real than it has in other productions, I think, because I have this moment of like, even before I meet her, that something unique happens that makes me think this really could be the one, rather than just every 7 years I find some guy who has a daughter who's greedy, and that, Because if that's the case, and I've been doing this for hundreds of years, like what makes today different, you know?
I always find it interesting that her boyfriend of sorts, Eric, is the only man around of her age who does not go to sea.
Hmm.
He's a hunter. He's there on land. He's there all the time. And
Yeah.
I think that she chafes at having this guy around all the time
Yeah.
because all the other women, they're in their weaving circle and so on, and their men are at sea, and the hope will come back.
Yeah.
But the community of women, but Senta is the one woman whose boyfriend is around,
Yeah.
and
And
I
he's a
like
little
her
clingy.
role.
He's a little clingy.
He's clingy. Let's just get married. He's like Giacchino is his name in Fidelio with Marcellina.
Yeah.
There are a lot of similarities I've always found between Fidelio and this opera about
Yeah.
my angel and so on. There's if you look at the libretti, Wagner was ripping off Beethoven, but that's
He
okay.
was.
So you just said something that I think is very central to all of your performances that I've seen that I want to return to and get to the next character who touches or doesn't touch. About channeling the humanity of your characters
Yeah.
and how it's not necessarily, in your view, and I concur, incumbent that we do every bit of study of what the composer and librettist intended and what happened in the time of the opera, but perhaps what makes these characters human, which I don't use the word relevant, but other people would say makes it relevant for today. So that Don Giovanni or Leporello have a humanity that may be anchored in a time and place and social outlook, but are very, very current and germane today in different ways. And the character that I'm getting to is in the opera Dead Man Walking, Joseph de Rocher. I went to the original 25 years ago in San Francisco and remember Susan Graham, and the only time she played the role actually of Sister Helen, and Frederica von Stade. And Susan Graham was my guest on my fifth anniversary show here a few months ago in April. And von Stade is the only guest I've had twice on the show, and I'd have her any time. She's willing to come. I had Joyce DiDonato here in May, who I adore. And you and Joyce DiDonato did a very memorable production directed by Ivo van Hove at the Metropolitan Opera, which was presented in HD. Jake Heggie is a friend of mine. He's the composer of the opera. I knew Terence McNally, the great librettist. And so I'm very connected to this opera. I love this opera. I've seen it in many productions in London, in Washington, in San Francisco, New York. I think it's a masterpiece. And it's an opera that can be very open to interpretation. Would you talk about the basic lines of the story?
Yeah. So one of the sort of brilliant and difficult things about this piece is it starts with this crime in the opera version specifically, which is a little different from the film if you've seen the film. But Joe, we first see Joe. He rapes and murders. He rapes this woman and murders two people. And then Sister Helen, who is a nun, is writing letters to Joe. We learn this real life person, if your listeners don't know, Sister Helen Prejean is a wonderful, wonderful human being who's been helping death row inmates and families of their victims for many years. Fierce advocate for the abolition of the death penalty. This is her book that this is based on, of this sort of amalgamation of a couple of characters in her book into Joe. And so basically, Sister Helen, through the real difficulty of trying to connect with this man, ends up kind of becoming friends with him. And by the end, they tell each other they love each other, in a friend, supportive, spiritual advisor way. And she kind of helps him to work through what he's done and to confess. It is a really uplifting piece, but also very dark in a lot of ways. The scenes with Sister Helen trying to connect with the families of the victims are just gut wrenching. And even though I've only done this role a couple of times, I've lived with it for a long time. I started working on it many, many years ago, and I agree with you. I think it's a total masterpiece. And I think any great piece of art is open to interpretation, and I think that's also true with this one.
Um, I've seen it for years, 25 years now, because the 25th anniversary production's coming up, and you're in it, correct?
Yeah.
Is it Jamie Barton playing Sister Helen?
Yeah,
Wow.
I'm super excited for that.
In San Francisco, where the opera was premiered 25 years ago. That will be September of 2025, just for people who want to know. September 14th is the opening. And only in recent productions have I fastened more than I did originally, perhaps because I knew the film very well, on Sister Helen's learning curve from the families of the victims.
Yeah.
Because one can, but I don't think one should, see this opera as being advocacy for eradicating the death penalty, something I believe in, but something that if that were the whole story would not be enough of the story.
Yeah, I agree.
And Sister Helen comes to learn that the families of the victims are justifiably angry and hurt, and their lives have been ruined. And also the mother of Joseph has gone through an incredible amount. And it was played originally by Frederica Vorchata, and in your cast recently at the Met, fantastically well by Susan Grant, just stunningly, stunningly well. And his two brothers come with her to visit in the prison, and there are cookies, and they're the simplest things, but nonetheless, these simple things like bringing cookies or Sister Helen having doubts.
Yeah.
And relying on another sister, I forget the character's name, but she's the Black Nun.
Yeah,
Played by LaTanya Moore, your production, beautifully. And how we all, I'm going to say need, maybe you want a different word, to turn to other people at certain times.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think you talked about like this is really true about the way I work on roles. I look for the real humanity, whether makes it relevant or not in a kind of topical way, which I think is sort of beside the point. If it's relevant in a human way, that's how we connect with one another. I think this piece, Joyce talks about it being a love story. I think that might be a quote from Sister Helen but she uses it a lot. And rather than a story about a crime. And I think one of the things it makes you look at, and I totally agree with you, it's not an anti-death penalty piece. It's not pro or anti-death. It actually kind of doesn't really worry about whether that's a good or bad thing and lets the audience think about that if they want to. What it does do is make you, I think in a good production, makes you as the audience consider both just how awful the thing is that this guy did, and he is still a human being just like you are. And maybe in different circumstances, maybe you would do something horrible and you would never be forgiven. And so bringing people a little closer to considering that person as a whole human, I think is the thing that piece does really well. And as a kind of side note, that's for me a personal connection, is when I first started looking at this piece, I started writing some death row inmates, and kind of connected with one that we wrote over several years, named Terrence Andrus. And I ended up visiting him a few times at the Plotkin unit in Texas. And, it's all good to talk about it in an opera, but then you're there in the real place, and this person you're talking to, even, he admitted to killed two people. And then he's also a poet and an artist and very funny and interesting. and we became really good friends. But that there's a kind of, those two feelings can be at odds with each other, and I think people in their normal life often just go with, oh well, that person's evil, and I think that's a very easy way to dismiss the actions of people, and I think is usually counterproductive in solving whatever problems are around those kinds of horrible things. Terrence, his case had gone to the Supreme Court a couple of times. At the first time, they told Texas they need to look at it again because his lawyer was incompetent. Second time, we had a more conservative court, and they rejected the case. He had a lot of mental health issues and ended up taking his own life. I guess it was 2 years ago now. And that was like just a few months before we did Dead Out Walking at the Met. So it's become a really I have to actually be careful to just do the piece and not connect it too much to my own feelings about it. But I think the central genius of both the libretto and Jake's music is to not shy away from the violence, not shy away from the pain of the families, but also make Joe really human. And it happens gradually over the piece. And people who have told me, so I get more conversations after this piece than any other thing I do, of people saying, I really hated you at the beginning. I hated you. And I found that I cared about you as the piece went along, and it really made me change the way I think about people who have done terrible things. So I really do think it's a piece that's brilliant and also really worth doing for the way that it kind of opens people's minds to their own humanity.
I introduced this by saying two characters who touch but don't quite touch.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember if there was a moment when your character and Sister Helen actually held hands, and it probably comes very late in the opera because he was not exactly, number one, as a dangerous prisoner, he was kept at a distance, but I think also she kept her distance, she the character, because for various reasons, being a Catholic nun, feeling that she would be overstepping a boundary, so that it had that same tension that we were talking about with the Dutchman and Zenta, but in a very different way, of two characters who connect powerfully, in the music and the words tell you that, but not physically.
Yeah.
Obviously, they're not going to for all kinds of narrative reasons. The production you did at the Met, I saw it 3 times in the theater. And then, sorry, folks, I was invited to do the pre-performance lecture before the HD broadcast at BAM, Brooklyn Academy of Music. And in the theater, and I don't want to spoil too much, there is use of video camera at certain times that bring certain scenes closer to the audience. The scenes between Sister Helen and Joseph, where they're revealing a lot about themselves. This was somewhat controversial among some people who felt that it's good enough, especially with Ryan McKinny and Joyce DiDonato, that you didn't need the intervention of cameras. At the scene where he is put to death, they use these cameras again in very graphic ways that I'm not going to describe because people can find the HD. But if you're acting simultaneously for the audience in the theater, both as yourself and then the person on video in direct relay, and in addition to audiences out in the world that are seeing neither you on the stage nor you on the cameras, but something in between. How do you modulate your acting? For whom are you acting? How did you do that?
So I think this is where my particular acting technique is very useful. I think often people think you're playing for a big theater, you need to play bigger. You're playing for a camera, you need to play smaller. I think there's some ways in which that has some truth to it, but To me, specificity, the bigger the space that you have, the more specific thoughts you need. And really, physicality, if you're in a big theater and you feel like you're bored because somebody's not moving, I would say 99% of the time what you're watching is somebody having not made choices, not made acting choices. Those choices may physicalize in a big way or a small way, but if you see an amazing actor like, you know, one of the like, I don't know, Anthony Hopkins or somebody do like Shakespeare in a, you know, Broadway play, and you can see just this thought to that thought, like the eyes just moving, even if you're in a big space, it reads perfectly. So for me, my goal was always to play the moment as specifically and honestly as I could. And to me, that's always going to read in all of those ways. And if something isn't reading in a big space, I resist the temptation to make it bigger. And I try to get to what's more specific, like not just specific in what I'm playing, but where it changes. Does it happen with this musical moment or with that one? And like, does this thought over here and that thought's over here? What, if there's physicalization, what makes that feel more real, not what makes it bigger for a theater or what makes it smaller for a camera? And then I let, you know, the camera people do the rest. I think that was pretty successful. And I think with opera, it's so hard. You know, we talk about acting in opera. Most people that, you know, have an opinion about acting in opera haven't spent a lot of time singing on stage. It is such a difficult thing to do. It is so, you know, it's such an extreme feat of the human endeavor. Like, it's very difficult for people in the audience to understand, like, just how much goes into being able to just do the basics of what we do. So I will admit that it's a lot to ask to be able to do these things. But the way that I teach acting, the way I think about it is trying to put those things together. The way you're going to sing it, the thought you're going to have, the action you're going to play, the physicality, all into one thing. So you're not splitting your brain into a bunch of different ideas. Because I don't think it's possible to think, oh, I'm playing for this big stage. Oh, now I'm playing for the camera. Oh, I'm playing for this other camera. I think you would just have a really disjointed performance. So for me, I'm trying to play Joe's story in a specific way as I can, and let the rest do what it does.
And sometimes, and Joe is one of them in part of the opera, he's immobile. And acting choices are very different for force when you're immobile. And I'm going to transition, I hope elegantly, to another role I did not see you do, but an opera that I absolutely adore. I think is the other great masterpiece, American masterpiece of the 21st century, Breaking the Waves.
Yeah.
Which I saw its premiere in Philadelphia. Who was the female lead in Houston when you performed it in April?
It was Lauren Snofer. She was brilliant.
Yeah. It's a magnificent opera based on the story of the film, which I thought was a great, great film about a man who is a oil rigger in the North Sea, who's paralyzed in an accident, and his new, rather innocent wife, and he's immobile.
Yeah.
So you played, was it pronounced Jan or Jan?
Jan. She says over and over, his name is Jan, his name is Jan. Yeah, I think that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about, where, you know, for those of you that don't know the piece very well, all of Act 2, I am paralyzed. I am totally immobile in a hospital bed. And like, I think in this production, I could use my left hand just a little bit, like that much. But even like moving my head much was out of bounds. So that's when your thought, your intention, your action from an actor's perspective is so important. You have to make strong, clear choices. And I think doing that kind of work can really help you in things that aren't restricted in that way, because often you'll see singers, we lovingly refer to them as opera arms. You know, sometimes a gesture is just a gesture and means nothing. Right? It feels good to, you know, sing a high note when you do this. But you don't need that always. And often refining your physicality down to what's necessary can actually make for clearer, more exciting storytelling. And I think, that's a piece that it's really required in Breaking the Waves. And also, I mean, that's one of the most physically difficult pieces I've ever done, I have to say, because your first two big scenes, you're having sex while you're singing. In the case of the second one, nearly fully nude, which creates all kinds of interesting, difficult vocal challenges, musical coordination challenges. The second act, fully immobile. The final scene, I walk in carrying her in my arms and like have to squat down and sit her down and do the whole thing on my knees. So like every scene has physical challenges that are very different from each other, and also acting challenges to make it not over the top, but still something that you really care about what these people are going through. And I think we did a pretty good job of achieving that.
Yeah. So now going from immobility to huge mobility, I want to talk about roles that you're preparing that you've not, I don't think, sung yet, in Puccini's Il Trittico, that you're going to be doing in Houston this fall in October, November. Michele, that's in Il Tabarro, yes, and then Johnny Schicchi, the title role in the opera Johnny Schicchi. So for people who don't know, these are three one-act operas. Puccini was loosely inspired by the Divine Comedy, in that Il Tabarro is purgatory, and Suor Angelica, that you're not in, was Paradiso, paradise, and the comedy, Johnny Schicchi, is Inferno, in hell, but it's in a very droll way. It's one of the funniest operas is Johnny Schicchi, but we're talking before about what happened to Senta and the Dutchman, that perhaps they go off to paradise. In a way, we have that in Suor Angelica in certain productions, but even though it's very tragic. But in Il Tabarro, let's start with that. Il Tabarro means the cloak. And I don't know how tall you are, but usually the character who plays Michele has to be somewhat tall, and the tenor has to be rather short, so that the cloak that you're wearing as you strangle him to death, you completely surround him with the cloak, and you.
I don't remember who our tenor is offhand, but I'm 6'2", so I feel like we'll probably be able to make it work.
Okay.
But yeah, I'm so excited for this, because I love singing Tabarro. Like, it's, I sang Scarpia once, and I just love that kind of Puccini dramatic baritone thing. He has this great aria, and like doing that on the same night as Schicchi is just like so fun to me. I love comedy, actually, and I don't get to do it that often. I've done several Leporados and Figaros, but...
Well, I want to get to Schicchi in a minute, but let's stick with Tabarro. I believe the woman's character is named Lauretta, and her husband is Michele, and her boyfriend is her boyfriend, the tenor. But they live on a barge in the Seine, and had Puccini asked me for advice, I would not have put that opera in Paris. I would have put it in Livorno in Tuscany, because Livorno is a working class port. It would have meant that all three operas were set in Tuscany, one in Florence, one in an abbey in the southern part of Tuscany. And it would have been a much more Tuscan trilogy. Puccini was very Tuscan. And this opera would have worked perfectly in Livorno, but he didn't ask me. So, but if ever I direct it, I'm setting it in Livorno.
Sure.
But basically, it's a romantic jealousy, the tight conditions of a barge in a river. And ultimately, the soprano and her tenor boyfriend can't get away with it. And Michele comes back, sings a great aria, and then surrounds the tenor in his cape and chokes him to death, which is great opera.
Yeah, great.
And but not comic in any way. And it's purgatory because Lauretta and Michele are still married after this movie has taken place, and this is their condition. But Johnny Schicchi is riotously funny. It's also very hard to perform. I've seen many bad productions because the people, if they're not Italians, often overact.
Sure.
And they wring their hands, povero Bozo being the person dying, Bozo Donati, and it's overdone.
Mhm.
Whereas I feel that you can act it spontaneously, as would an Italian, that they would not want to be overt in their mourning
Yeah.
because they're all very avaricious and they're waiting for him to die so that the will can be read and they see what they get, the mills, wherever in Fucecco, whatever it's called, and who gets the house in Florence. And then in the middle of this is the character, maybe her name is Laurette, I'm forgetting now, who sings to her father, Johnny Schicchi, that she loves this boy, O mio bambino caro. If you don't let me marry this boy, I'm going to jump in the Arno River. And that's it. And it all works out in the end, at least for Johnny Schicchi, who's very thieving, and all the relatives cannot say anything. And that's the funny part.
Yeah.
So you called libretto, but it's done usually in very strong Tuscan dialect and accents. It's one of those operas like Rosenkavalier where there's a lot of local dialect, and it has to be done that way.
Yeah.
Even if you're playing it in Houston or Stockholm or wherever it
I'm sure we will have a great Italian coach. Houston's really good about having diction coaches, so we'll have somebody that will help us with Tuscan, I'm sure.
Have you begun looking at it?
Yeah, I was just this morning actually, and yesterday been looking at. But I'm, it's funny. I've known these pieces for a long time, and I've always. I don't know if you know the Italian actor Roberto Benigni, but I always think of him for Gianni Schicchi, like that style of like. It's not necessarily slapstick or big physically, but his shifts are so instantaneous and always very earnest. He's like earnestly angry or earnestly like in love. And I think there's something in that with Schicchi that's like these sharp changes and kind of what comes across as clever, right? Like he's supposed to be clever is really just about his mind working quickly and sort of going from one thing to another, which I don't think requires like the kind of overdone spaghetti and meatballs, kind of Italian theatrical.
Italy spaghetti and meatballs in Florence.
Yeah, exactly.
But also Benigni is the perfect person who watches films in Italian to copy the Tuscan accent. He more than any actor today has that accent. So just the word C, the letter C rather, can either be you don't have a Coca-Cola, you have a ho-ho-hola. I'm not kidding. The C becomes an H at sometimes. But other CE, for example, like and CI, like ceci, chickpeas, for the Tuscans become sheshi.
Yeah.
Live in Cecina. So CECI is a sh, but the A and the O, ho-ho-hola, is, or haza, where are you going? Meboa haza, kaza. It's an HA. If you get those down, you're about 50% on your way. It's the letter C.
Okay. You might actually coach me on this later because I'm.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
My favorite, if anybody's listening, most people know La Vita è Bella, which is the most famous Benigni film that made it over here. But if you really want to see like a hysterical Italian comedy, watch Gianni Stecchino, which is like hilarious. He plays two characters in it. One of them's like the bad guy, and it's just so funny. Very good.
I meant to say one last thing about Joyce DiDonato, and then I want to go back toward you. She was on my show on May 9th of this year. And I purposely did not want to ask her all the Joyce DiDonato questions that she gets all the time. So we went off in very interesting directions, and she's always engaged, but she was very engaged with these questions. And we spent a fair amount of time talking about her work in prisons and how she goes and works and helps prisoners compose music or sing or perform, or in the case of women, incarcerated women, write lullabies for their children. And it's a fascinating thing. And people can just go to YouTube and enter Fred Plotkin on Fridays, Joyce DiDonato. I can send it to you, Ryan. And it was fascinating. She was just terrific as always. Now, I want to ask you I think listeners have already come to understand your degree of what I'm going to call social engagement, if you prefer a different term, use that. Um, Tell me about the President's Leadership Council, the Search for Common Ground.
Yeah, so it's an organization that is basically the largest peace building nonprofit in the world, is the way they put it. And I think they exist in 30 countries or something. Um, and I think common ground could be a triggering word for people these days, because I think some people find that implies sort of compromise, which on certain topics, compromise can feel like injustice, right? Um, but the kind of common ground, search for common ground way of doing things isn't really around compromise. It's around finding overlap with communities that are having a hard time connecting, and usually in violent conflict. That's the kind of the main place that they engage is in areas with violent conflict. And they come up with innovative ways to solve those problems. And one of the sort of core things that really resonates with me as a person, the way I think about being a human being in relationship with other human beings in the world, is they say for any solution that we're going to come up with, we need all the stakeholders to find a way to be with each other, to communicate with each other, to eventually trust each other. And that means people that have done bad things. In every case that they are around in the world, there's always a party that they're having to deal with that has done something truly terrible, you know. But to me, digging deeper into the why somebody did something terrible, even if you don't think of it as like a moral, you know, I'm doing this because all people are actually good deep down. You don't have to believe that, but just from a kind of pragmatic standpoint, if you want to solve a problem, you need to deal with all of the people that are part of that problem. Mm-hmm. So an example where this really worked, that I butcher this story a little bit, so you have to go to their website to learn more about the stuff they do. But one of the ones that stuck out to me was, I think it was in South Sudan. It was the rebel army was raping women at an alarming rate. It was like part of their warfare style. And Search for Common Ground has office there in South Sudan, and they were trying to kind of figure out how to work with this issue. And they talked to the head general of this army. And basically through these conversations and through like a while of building trust, so that these people didn't feel like they were going to have the rug, you know, pulled out from under them, learned that this general and all of the people in charge didn't really want that to be happening, but they felt like they couldn't save face with the way the UN was trying to, you know, kind of put regulations in there and sort of enforce it. They didn't feel like that was doable from their own, you know, they were going to get kicked out of their army, whatever. Like there was reasons that they felt like they couldn't handle it the way they'd been told to. And so, but they didn't want that to be happening. It wasn't like they didn't like it either. And they came up with this. So Search for Common Ground often uses arts in some way to solve these problems. And they came up with this comic book that they developed with this general and his team, that essentially was this like, why you shouldn't do that, and how it helps our cause if you don't do this. But coming up with it with the people that were kind of from the outside really part of the problem. And it ended up within a very short period of time, reducing the rate of sexual assault by like 80% or something insane. And there's a bunch of stories like that across the world that, you know, I've learned about since I've become involved with them. I actually did their field training of like how they come up with programs, just because out of curiosity. And so I could, you know, talk a little more about it. And I think That's something that I think right now is so desperately needed. Like, we are in such a, you know, I have very strong opinions about politics and right and wrong, and as I think we all do. So I am in no way saying that we should let people off the hook who've done bad things in terms of accountability. However, I think like when we, and I'm talking more on a level of leadership now, not necessarily on a personal level, although I think this is true for me. I think when we shut people out from any kind of connection or conversation, we isolate them and we have no chance to come up with creative solutions to problems. And I think it is very easy, you know, anybody that follows me on social media will know that I'm quite liberal. I'm not a fan of our current president. I have a lot of issues with people that support him. However, if I can play Joseph Desrochers and see him as a human being, I can see a person that voted for Trump for all the wrong reasons, in my opinion, as a human being, and try to understand them. And maybe when some connection is built, maybe there's a possibility for solutions. I think it is pretty much guaranteed impossible to have a solution that is long lasting and a peaceful one without having trust and connection across parties. Another phrase I really like from this set of people is, whatever is gained by force must be maintained by force. And so that is very true in our current climate, right? If we, in the United States, but also in the world, if we, let's say, I'm just talking about like Democrats, if we somehow like figure out a way to get back in charge, but we don't have a way of getting people behind the same ideas, we will have another, bounce back where somebody like Trump is back in charge. And I'm not an expert in those things, and I don't mean to say that there's a lot of different ways of thinking about this. But I think as a general idea, trying to understand what's going on a deeper level, not understand, like listen to what somebody says they want, right? I think there's a big difference there that's difficult. So what Joseph Desrochers says he wants is for Sister Helen to help him not get killed, right? But what he needs on a personal level, what he needs is to be seen. He needs to be seen and heard as a human being. He doesn't know that when they first start talking. But that releases him from this suffering, right? That connection. He'd actually, in the end, it's kind of okay with him that he dies, right? Like he feels okay with it at the end. And so all that to say, I think when you're looking at these things and you're trying to connect with a person or people who you think are very bad in a lot of ways, you don't have to accept their premise. You don't have to accept what they think should happen. You don't have to accept those things to be able to see them as a full human being and try to understand what their like underneath needs are. And I think we can experience this when we have, friends or family that we're finding it's difficult to connect with because we disagree on lots of different things. And Search for Common Ground does a great job of what are the ways that aren't hot button things that people who have deep, difficult disagreements can connect. There's lots of like soccer games or like making music together, making theater together. When you do something with someone that's a collaborative, creative thing, you start to see them as a person in a way that is very difficult if you're just focused on the ways you're different.
My feeling on this, I correspond, I would say, is a correlate that I believe that we all as humans have certain basic needs. And these needs are not cognizant of political party or religion, but food, shelter, When a natural disaster comes, like flooding in Texas or earthquakes or fires in California, in LA, your hometown, you name it, um, that the needs are the same
Mhm.
and that the human response should come not from I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm a liberal, I'm a conservative, but I'm a human. And this could have been me, and one day it may be me, and therefore I would hope to have the same kind of human outreach. The way I actively do this is, I don't know if you know, Ryan, that I've written many cookbooks and I'm very in the food world. Opera is number one, but food is number two. Is that I've worked on projects, I've initiated some in different parts of the world with the goal of keeping people where they live by having sustainable food environments there so they don't have to migrate.
Yeah.
Because we talk about migration, and a certain amount of migration and immigration and emigration are important and necessary when there are economic needs, when there are other needs, when there are political issues, like if you're a woman in Afghanistan, you need to be out for your own safety and for your fulfillment. But I've set up programs in different places where I basically look at what the local crops are or the local animals are and help them develop programs there to cultivate these and then use the money that you earn by selling some of the product, not eating it for yourself only, to build clinics and build schools.
Mm.
So one case I worked on in Africa, it meant camel milk, which could be preserved and turned into cheese or yogurt or long-term conservation milk, could be sold. We then were able to build a clinic and get vaccines so that all the people were vaccinated against basic illnesses. It meant that men who went out to sea, like the Flying Dutchman, to fish in increasingly overfished waters because trawlers from Spain and Portugal and France came and swept up all the fish, the men did not have to go out to earn their living fishing and could be home in their communities and schools, and therefore literacy and so on. And the people from that part of West Africa didn't migrate. They didn't have to. And there are comparable things that we can find in much of the world
I think what's
involving
lovely
agriculture and
about that,
food source.
I,
Pardon
I
me?
oh, sorry, go ahead, finish your
Yeah.
thought.
No,
I
I'm
just
done.
what's lovely about it is that I am assuming talking with people in those areas, like try to understand the situation there first, right? And I think often if you point to some of these, NGOs or people that are well-meaning, some of the billionaires that we see on the news will often say they're doing something for a certain area and are basically just coming in and sort of doing it in the most colonial way of like, you are all stupid and here's what you need to do. One of the things I really like about Search is that all of their local teams are made up of local people. So it is essentially like, so often in these situations, the people that are in difficult environments know what they need, right? Or if they don't, it's because they haven't had the time and the space to think about it. So, giving resources to local people to actually like come up with their own creative solutions, people that know the ins and outs of the difficulties, I think is a really big, important element. I also think it speaks to, just on an interpersonal level, so I live in Asheville, North Carolina now. And we had a big, some of you might remember, devastating hurricane last fall, Helene. And it brought a lot of people together to help each other. And Asheville itself is a very, very liberal city, like one of the more liberal cities in the country. The second you go outside of Buncombe County, it's very, very conservative and very rural. But if I go to people, I work with some people we have a vacation rental cabin side business to try to save ourselves from only relying on the, sometimes ins and outs of the opera world. We work with a lot of people who are from these really rural areas. And if I go in and I tell them, I don't know, maybe guns is a good example. You don't need a gun. Guns are bad. Nobody should have a gun. Well, maybe that's true, or maybe it isn't. But I don't know anything about their life, right? And so if I try to understand it, A, maybe I'll learn something, but B, maybe I will have a better way of talking to them about something I have a concern about, right? Turns out like near where they are, there's bears, and this woman that, helps us take care of our homes, like really feels like having a gun in that situation is much safer. Also, there's people. I am not to say that I am pro guns. I'm not at all, but just as an example. But like talking to people and understanding their situation first before you sort of impose your ideas on it, I think is such an important part of relating with people, but also especially when it comes to kind of conflicts or difficulties in different regions. And I love your story about that. I feel like that's such in line with the kind of thing that makes me excited.
I just want to complete that story, though. In my case, frankly, I didn't let the people do what they were doing because I'm very schooled in basic questioning. Why is the question I would always ask to Donald Trump? Why this? Why that? There's a candidate running for mayor of New York now, Zoran Mamdani. I think my question for him would be how. And there are these who, what, when, where, why, and how tackle most of what we need to know if we ask the right one of those. And in this particular case in West Africa, what they did every day, they had all these female camels who were full of milk and they were uncomfortable and they had to be milked every day. And they would let the milk go on the ground. And I said, why are you letting it go on the ground? Well, we don't need it. It's more than we need. So that's how I proposed. Maybe there are other things you could do with the milk. And then I was able to get some funding and we were able to start that program in a very small way. But, I realized that, yes, they could make a profit, but the profit had to be spent on something. And it was not just about more money in the pocket, although that's good, but specifically a medical clinic in a school and a way to keep the men home more so the families were together more. I know we could ask lots of stuff on this, but I also want to spare your voice, Mr. Dutchman. Can you just tell me, is it pronounced Helio Arts?
Helio Arts, which is now doesn't really in any form officially exist anymore, but it's
Okay.
It was kind of a fun side quest for other ADHD people out there for a few years. That sorry, you didn't ask an actual question, but Helio Arts is how.
What is it?
Yeah. So
what was it?
I have filmmakers in my family. My dad was a director of photography, and I've kind of been around film a lot as a younger person. Had big ideas of how to do film and opera, which now have actually translated into some stage productions that include film in ways that I like. But during the pandemic, right when things happened, when everything got shut down, I was lucky to have a couple of companies were paying some of the amount that got canceled. So I had a little bit of lead time to like make some choices. And my original thought was, well, I want to make something. I want to make some kind of art, and I want to support artists who are, not working. And so I started these videos on YouTube called Keep the Music Going was the first version of it. And then made a bunch of silly stuff. One, we did, Jamie Barton and I did this very funny Rheingold scene called Corona Dämmerung, where I'm, in a bathrobe and drinking vodka straight out of the bottle, and she's brushing her teeth, and we're, Fricka and Wotan are arguing. It was very funny.
I'm laughing because she and I did a Siegfried thing together.
We made a lot of weird things back in the. So this part of me feels like I have a kind of nostalgia for the freedom to make whatever. That was such a strange time that nobody really judged anything that came out, so you could just try stuff. Anyway, that led to us making actual films for opera companies. We did one for Glimmerglass, a couple for Houston Grand Opera, one for Dallas. And one for the Kennedy Center. my wife Tanya, who is also a director, she and I basically did all of it ourselves, and that turned into then a streaming platform that we built um, with Alex Romano and some other folks, and called Helio Arts, which was sort of the umbrella for like the things we had made and things that felt like, my feeling about film and opera, like the HD broadcasts are interesting to me in a way. They're sort of like a documentary of a thing. You're not the audience, right? If you're watching it in a theater, like you are not the main audience. You are watching something happening with an audience and with performers. Interesting on its own. But when you're watching a great film, you're the audience, right? The director has thought of you sitting there as the receiver of the message. And so we wanted to make pieces that were really films that used opera within a film setting, and in more like art film style. And we made a bunch of them. And so Helio was a kind of way of showcasing those pieces, which eventually got absorbed by Marquis. And I worked for Marquis for a little while. I still think there's a lot of untapped potential in the film and opera universe. Maybe not financially, I don't know, but in terms of like interesting art to be made, I think there's a lot of things we learned during that time that kind of got shoved aside the second we could all get back on stage, which understandable, like opera companies are just trying to stay afloat. But we've had a few little projects here and there since then. Most of our film equipment was destroyed in the hurricane, so that's put a damper on our film ambitions. But there's still some things out there that we're still gonna work on.
So Ryan McKinney, I know, I can feel it that there are so many things I can talk to you about, but I do want to be mindful of your time and your voice, which is a beautiful voice, and you're a great artist. I commend people to go see you wherever you're performing. And you have a website, ryanmckinney.com, I'm guessing. Okay.
No
MCKI. It's what?
No E in McKinney. I'm the only one in the world.
Yes, I was about to say MCKINNY. McKinney. Did I leave anything out that I should have asked you?
I don't think so. I'm certain we could talk for hours and hours. So I appreciate you hearing my voice. We do have a Dutchman tomorrow, but this has really been a pleasure.
So Ryan McKinney, thank you very much.
Thank you, Fred.